For those of you not familiar with it yet, we're going to tell you a lot about what Flower Communion is today, including with our story time for all ages. So I have a story from a little book called A Lamp in Every Corner. That's a UU history story book. And I'm going to read it, but I'm going to add a little bit here and there. So this is called A Plain and Simple Beauty, the Flower Communion, 1923. In the city of Prague, in the land of Czechoslovakia, in the year 1923, a time between two world wars, there was a church. But the building did not look much like a church. Some churches have towers with bells that ring out over the land. Some churches have tall spires that reach to the sky. Some churches have massive doors of carved wood, or enormous windows of stained glass like this space, with colored light shining through. Some churches have great organs and hundreds of pipes, from the small ones like drinking straws to the huge ones that touch the ceiling. Some churches have statues or pictures or candles or chalices. This church had none of those things. It had no bells, no spires, no stained glass windows. It had no organ to make beautiful music. It didn't even have a piano. That's probably sacrilege. I'm not sure this congregation could do without music. It didn't even have flowers to start with. The church did have some things. It had 4 walls and a ceiling and a floor. It had a door and a few windows. It had some wooden chairs, but that was all. Plain and simple. And those of you who were part of this congregation and this church for a year or more remember the times when we did not meet in this building. Remember the times when this church also met in a plain and simple space, or a few plain and simple spaces. We have a plain and simple church. The people declared, because we are a plain and simple people. We need nothing more. The church had people who came every Sunday, and they were the most important part of all. Because without people, a church, any church, is just a building. No matter how tall its spires, how loud its bells, how beautiful its windows. Without the people, it is not a church. The church also had one other important thing. It had a minister named Norbert Čapek. He had been the minister at the Plain and Simple Church for 2 years. Every Sunday, Minister Čapek went to the church and he spoke to the people while they listened, sitting quiet in those hard wooden chairs. When he was done speaking, the people talked a little bit amongst themselves, and then they went home. And that was all. No music, no candles, no food, not even coffee and treats after the service, right? Aghast. We're aghast by that. But Minister Čapek had sometimes wondered if there might be something, perhaps just a little bit of something more. He wrote some songs, and the people sang them. But nothing else came to his mind, so the church went on, plain and simple as before. But springtime came to the city of Prague in the land of Czechoslovakia in the year 1923, and Reverend Norbert Čapek went for a stroll. I'm sure many of us have done that this spring, just not the last couple days as much. The rains had come, the birds were singing, and the flowers were blooming all over the land. This world was beautiful. Then an idea came to him, simple and clear, plain as day. The next Sunday, he asked all the people in the church to bring a flower. Or a budding branch, or even a twig. Each person was to bring one. What kind, they asked. What color, what size? You choose, he said. Each of you choose what you like. And so on the next Sunday, which was the first day of summer, the people came with flowers of all different colors and sizes and kinds. There were yellow daisies and red roses. There were white lilies and blue asters, dark-eyed pansies and light green leaves. Purple, pink, orange, and gold. There were all those colors and more. Flowers filled the vases, and the church wasn't so plain and simple anymore. Reverend Čapek spoke to the people while they listened, sitting quietly in those hard chairs. He said, "These flowers are like ourselves. Different colors, different shapes, and different sizes, each needing different kinds of care, but each beautiful, each important and special in its own way." This was a bit radical, because this was a church unlike what had been traditional there. This was a church that included both Christians and non-Christians, people who were changing what they believed. Some had strong beliefs and others were still trying to figure out, which was uncommon for those days and those places. So it was particularly poignant to see the beauty in the diversity of those flowers. And when Reverend Čapek was done speaking, the people talked a little bit among themselves, and then they each chose a different flower before they went home. And that was all. And it was beautiful and plain and simple as the day, and yet touched each heart, knowing that their beauty was welcome and that their beauty was witnessed in this space of community and loved by those who were different, but still saw value in one another.
I'm going to share some of the story behind the flower communion today, and it's such a rich story. I did bring some copies of it. If you'd like one after the service, I've set them out by the coffee treats and on the welcome table. You'll find them there. It was 2 years ago at the Fridley Community Center that I experienced my first flower communion. I had never heard of such a thing. But per the Thursday update, I brought my sprig of lilac, placed it in the vase up front, and at the right time in the service, I went up and selected a different flower to bring home. In between, I heard the story as we heard it this afternoon already. Later on my blog, I described it as a sort of flower exchange extravaganza, so simple and almost cute. I wasn't being dismissive, but compared to the formality of the Lutheran communion services I'd grown up with, this one was disarming in its simplicity. But the story stuck with me into the following week, and I wanted to know more. After reading several short biographical sketches of Norbert Čapek, I found the authoritative biography by Richard Henry in the library at United Seminary. I'd gone home that Sunday morning knowing the flower communion meant to evoke fellowship and faithfulness across diversity among Čapek's congregation and ours. But until I learned the story behind the story, I didn't realize the full power of that fellowship and faithfulness. Originally for Čapek's community, but today also for ours. So this is some of what I learned. Born in 1870 in Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, Norbert Čapek grew up Catholic. He had a religious spirit. He was active in his parish as a child. But as a teenager, he grew disheartened because of his priest's cynicism. And he felt that the rigid belief and authority of the Catholic Church simply couldn't produce the warm-hearted spirituality he longed for. So, at age 18, he became Baptist, and fervently Baptist. He was ordained a Baptist minister at 25, and over the next 20 years, he proved himself a powerful force. A compelling preacher, editor of several religious journals, a prolific writer and composer of hymns, 90 of them altogether in his lifetime, founder of almost a dozen Baptist churches, and a leader in the Union of Baptist Churches of Moravia and Slovakia. A powerful force. Also during these years, he married and had 5 children, though his first wife died very young in 1900. He remarried a year later, and his second wife raised those 5 children with him, and they added 3 more of their own. Now, Čapek was a visionary thinker who grew increasingly liberal, even radical. He was influenced by his study of the past and his openness to the theological ferment of his day, especially the social gospel movement. Ultimately, he was convinced that the true faith of the Czech people was neither Catholic nor Baptist, but what he called a free faith, one that prized individual conscience and pursued an ardent community life rooted in love. His writings became openly critical of the Catholic Church, which was the state religion of Bohemia, and they were increasingly censored. In 1914, with World War I on the horizon and feeling increasingly under threat from the government, he accepted a call to serve as a pastor of a small Baptist church in New York, followed soon after by a call to a larger Baptist church in New Jersey. However, soon after coming to the United States, his second wife died of a stroke, leaving him to parent their 3 school-age children. The other 5 were grown by then. About the same time, he was twice accused of heresy by Baptist colleagues, once for seeming to question Jesus' divinity, another time for suggesting the kingdom of God was more about seeking social justice than accepting Jesus into one's heart. He managed to be acquitted both times, but the personal sting ran deep, and he left his job as a pastor to begin pursuing a PhD. It was then that he met Maya, also from Bohemia and a librarian at the New York Public Library. They were married in 1919, and with her encouragement, he resigned his Baptist credentials, acknowledging that his faith no longer fit that tradition. He was 49 years old at the time. Without a church of their own, Norbert and Maya sent their 3 school-age children out every Sunday morning to different church Sunday schools in their New Jersey community and had them come home and share over Sunday dinner what they had learned in the different churches. One day they were deeply intrigued by the children's report on the local Unitarian church and decided they needed to check that one out for themselves. They were overjoyed to find, as Norbert wrote in his journal, not only clear heads, but warm hearts too. And from then on, at age 51, Čapek's spiritual vision found a home in the Unitarian tradition. After the First World War ended, Czechoslovakia became an independent democracy. Čapek believed the Czech people held deep spiritual democratic inklings, and he was eager to be part of the nation's rebirth. So his family joined many other Czechs in returning from abroad. He personally hoped to establish a Unitarian church that might rekindle the free faith of the Czech people that he was convinced had roots deep in their past. To say he was successful would be an understatement. Once in Prague, he set out to build a church by gathering people. Did I say he was a compelling preacher and a visionary thinker? In the fall of 1921, he began meeting with small groups of people, a couple dozen here, a couple dozen there, across the city, to describe his vision of this new church. The following April 1922, when he held the inaugural worship service of the Prague Congregation of Liberal Religious Fellowship, there were over 1,200 persons in attendance. A year later, there were days when the large church where they rented space was filled to its 3,000-person capacity, with overflow standing outside and listening in. On Tuesday evenings, as many as 700 people came to hear him give the sermon a second time and discuss it. Successful and then some. His congregation included persons of all social classes, varied ethnic, educational, and religious backgrounds, Protestant, ex-Catholic, ex-Jew, and many without any church background at all who were drawn by Čapek's energy and vision. These were the people, a dazzling bouquet of humanity, for whom he created the flower communion. It was, as I said earlier, a simple ritual, almost cute, except when practiced while rebirthing the spirituality of the Czech people through fashioning a community founded on friendship and love. In that context, it proved a ritual that Čapek himself described afterwards as so powerful and impressive that I had never experienced anything like it. He added, even the most dry and rationalistic members were moved, and many an eye brightened through tears. For the next 20 years, Čapek's ministry flourished. Soon Maya was ordained as well and served the congregation and community alongside him. At one point, the Unitarian Church in Prague was the largest Unitarian congregation in the world. They had a Sunday school with over 300 children and sponsored a church leadership training school. They partnered with a local doctor to offer extensive community counseling programs for expectant parents, marital issues, conflict resolution, and grief. Čapek even wrote a curriculum for religious history and philosophy that was used in public schools. His conviction that liberal faith, prizing individual conscience and communal fellowship, could leaven the whole of life was being shown true in practice. And then the Nazis came knocking, literally. First in 1938 at the nation's border, Hitler demanded Czechoslovakia's southern territory. Their pleas for security were ignored by France, Great Britain, and the US, and the Czech government felt it had no choice but to accept Hitler's terms, although there were fierce protests by the Czech people, and Čapek raised his voice with them. The Sunday, this was September 25, 1938, the Sunday after the Nazis seized the southern territory, Čapek declared from the pulpit, "We Czechs are becoming the backbone of the history of humanity. We are today the only nation in the whole of Europe that is ready to resist oppression. When we face our descendants, we will never have to feel ashamed of the fact that as a small nation in the middle of Europe, we were ready to defend human dignity, freedom, and justice from violence, lies, and lawlessness." Did he really imagine that his community and its flower communion were a match for fascism? It seems he did. By the following year, 1939, all of Czechoslovakia was in German control. The American Unitarian Association wrote to Čapek, offering him a minister-at-large position in the United States with a stipend that would last until he was able to draw a pension beginning 2 years later. He thanked them, but politely and firmly declined, explaining that he could not leave his people in this moment no matter what sufferings might come. But he and Maya decided that she would go to the United States for a speaking tour to raise support for the congregation back in Prague. So she came here in 1940, bringing with her to the U.S. for the first time the ritual of the flower communion. Back in Czechoslovakia, Čapek found himself ministering not simply to a congregation, but to a national community. Prague was the capital, centrally located and by far the largest city in the country. The Czech people felt abandoned by the world, but were united in their spirit. Life in the congregation in Prague, as well as the 6 mission centers that it sponsored around the country, continued with fervor. Unable to buck the German occupation openly, the people poured all their energy into deeper fellowship and mutual aid. Speaking in the United States, Maya reported that the flower communion was being celebrated both in Prague and in the missions, now as an antidote to despair, an act of quiet resistance to the Reich, and as a mystical embrace of dignity, beauty, and freedom in the very shadow of death. Because of the crowds that came weekly to hear Čapek preach, Gestapo agents also came each Sunday, listening for any covert message he might be trying to pass to his congregation. Although he often slipped hidden phrases of national pride into his messages, there is no indication that the Gestapo ever caught on to the full subversive character of his preaching, which harnessed the people's imagination to uplift dignity and compassion in a million ways. When Čapek turned 70, this was early June 1940, his congregation planned a festive celebration. More than 700 persons came, including noted guests from many other churches and organizations. Over 100 congratulatory letters and telegrams arrived, but the showstopper was a gift he received from the church's board of trustees, no doubt delivered after and apart from the public fanfare. They gave him a shortwave radio. As with all such radios sold in German-occupied lands, it carried a tag that warned users that listening to foreign broadcasts was a crime punishable by death. From then on, it might be said that Čapek flirted daily with death, because it became his morning routine to listen to BBC or Voice of America broadcasts each day for the next 9 months. It is not clear how widely he shared the news that he gleaned from these broadcasts, though it surely shaped the tone of his preaching. The following March, 1941, the Nazis came knocking again, literally, and this time directly on his door. Both Norbert Čapek and his youngest daughter, Zora, who was 28 at the time, were arrested and charged with listening to and disseminating foreign broadcasts. Čapek was also charged with high treason on account of his public preaching. After an initial trial, they remained in jail almost a year before the appeal was heard in April 1942. Both of them were found guilty of listening to foreign broadcasts, but the court decided that Čapek's preaching did not rise to the level of treason. Zora was sentenced to 18 months. Čapek, on account of his age, was given 12 months, and the recommendation by the court that he receive credit for the 11 months already spent in jail, a reprieve. Zora served her sentence and survived the war. But when Čapek's sentence was received at the Gestapo headquarters in Prague, it was overwritten. The case officer there wrote on his file, "Send this prisoner to Dachau. His return is unwished." This was likely in retaliation for the recent assassination of the Nazi officer overseeing the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. The Gestapo were livid, and they executed several opinion leaders in response. So it was on July 5th, 1942, Čapek arrived in Dachau, where he was put to hard labor for a little over 3 months. The only eyewitness report from Dachau, a letter written to Maya soon after the war ended, came from a Catholic priest who was with Čapek in Dachau. He described their living conditions there as brutal, writing, "There was such terrible hunger that we were driven to digging for earthworms and eating them." And he recounted Čapek, the person, with awe, describing how he offered encouragement at all times, shared his eager rations, and brought many others to faith there in the desolation of Dachau. He concluded telling Maya that Norbert was a man whose very countenance carried in it a higher power. In fact, 3 months before being sent to Dachau, the day before their appeal was decided, Čapek had passed a piece of paper to his daughter Zora. It contained his final poem. In that poem, he wrote, "I have lived amidst eternity." It was perhaps his own way of acknowledging that higher power that so framed his being. The handful of letters that he was allowed to send from Dachau reflect the steadiness of his faith even in these final months. He reported he had composed several new songs, adding to the more than 90 he'd already written. He called these last ones some of his best, although all of them were lost in the camp. In one letter, he clarifies his theological thinking, writing, "The goal of liberal religion is a harmonious, strong, confident, active, loving personality in harmony with itself, with nature, with humanity, and the spirit of all life. It should not be thought that God is incarnated only in Jesus." He was still visionary and compelling in Dachau at hard labor 10 weeks before his death. On October 12, 1942, Norbert Čapek was put on an invalid transport and taken to another site to be murdered by poison gas. It may be apocryphal, an act of sacred imagination, because it is nowhere mentioned in Richard Henry's meticulously researched biography. But there is undoubtedly truth to the stories which you will find online in writings about the Flower Communion that tell how there in Dachau, Čapek celebrated his final Flower Communion, inviting his fellow prisoners to find whatever bit of green or beauty, whatever glimpse of art or echo of life could be found in the prison yard, and to make a simple pile. No vase this time. Then, speaking yet once more about the inherent dignity of each person, the grand and glorious reach of infinite love into the human soul, and the joy, the true freedom that is born of human community when care is genuine and love is real. And finally, beckoning the prisoners to retrieve some shabby bit from that motley pile, transfigured now into priceless treasure. Maya never saw her husband again after coming to the U.S. The outbreak of World War II kept her from returning. She only learned of his death after the war. And yet, thanks to her powerful interpretation of the flower communion to congregations in the United States, it spread quickly and became the most widely celebrated ritual among Unitarians around the world. So this is where the story ought to end, but I cannot quite let it rest. Today, fascism is once again too much afoot. The freedom of press and opposition voices are under attack right here. Brutality is valorized and empathy is mocked. Reproductive rights and voting rights are rolled back. Universities, learning itself is targeted, and words are turned inside out. Official rhetoric demonizes the humanity of others. Trans persons are made outcast, their rights trampled, their very existence threatened. Immigrants are being daily disappeared from our own streets. Our government is being twisted to evil ends, and our planet laid waste for profit and the lust of empire. There is no telling how perilous the politics of our future will be, except for this telling: too perilous. There is no telling how damaged the planet will be before the tide turns, except for this telling: too damaged. And so I end here. The flower communion is such a simple ritual, almost cute, but so much more. Unfazed by peril, undaunted by damage, an unassuming ritual bearing beauty and truth. We are priceless glory, uniquely needy, uniquely gifted. We belong to one another. Creating community is birthing joy. In a perilous and damaged future, these truths may seem no stronger than a sprig of lilac, but I tell you, they are priceless treasures, and they are ours. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.